Hi, I'm Mr. Simons and I've been at my desk marking all day, so I haven't had time to set up the equipment, get out the Wacom tablet and start putting it together for one of those proper full-on videos. Instead, I've just got my phone here, a little bit of light coming from here, and what we're going to do is talk briefly about what policies can a government use to address external stability. All right, that's going to be our focus, so let's roll the intro. Okay, so when we're talking about external stability, remember we're talking about the ability of an economy to manage its financial relationships with other economies. So Australia looking at whether it can manage its financial obligations to other countries around the world. And you can see other videos on these concepts by clicking the links at the top there. So if we're looking not at what external stability is, but instead how do we address it, we've got a couple of options, but let's start with what not to do. So the first thing is, if we're trying to improve external stability, don't use monetary policy. Monetary policy is about fighting inflation and pushing up economic activity. Really, if we're changing the level of the cash rate to affect interest rates, maybe there could be some impacts. There could be. For example, if we slow down the economy with higher interest rates, that might slow purchases of imports, which might improve BOGs and improve the CAD. But this doesn't happen in reality. The RBA doesn't sit down and think specifically about external stability when it sets the cash rate. So let's put that to one side. Another policy that can be used, or a policy that can be used, would be macroeconomic policy and particularly fiscal policy. Now remember, one of the major causes of our current account deficit and external stability issues is that savings investment gap in Australia, where our investment needs exceed the level of domestic savings. So if the government could increase the level of domestic savings, particularly through the federal budget, that might reduce the need for capital inflows, reduce the required NPY outflows, and shrink the size of the CAD and improve external stability. So there are really two ways that the government could try and increase the domestic pool of savings. Number one is maybe the government could try and reduce its own need for capital inflows. So that means that the government moves from, say, a budget deficit to a smaller deficit or to a surplus, which means that it doesn't need capital inflows to come in to fund its extra spending. Let me just break this down for a sec. So let's say a government has a budget deficit. That means government spending exceeds taxation revenue, and that money has to come from somewhere because the government doesn't have that money. The spending is larger than the revenue. So the money comes in from overseas because there's not a lot of savings domestically. So if the government doesn't have a difference between G and T, or if T exceeds G, revenue is larger than expenditure, well, hey, there's no need for those extra capital inflows. So that will shrink the government's need for foreign capital, which will then shrink the NPY outflows, CAD, external stability, that kind of thing, particularly around foreign equity, foreign debt, particularly around the government bringing in foreign debt to solve that savings investment gap. But that doesn't really fix the private sector, and the private sector is the big driver of the savings investment gap. But just remember that as economists, we don't worry too much about the private sector's activities because of the Pitchford thesis, because consenting adults, because we think that the private sector does its work and generally knows what it's doing when it gets into debt. So we don't worry too much about that. But if we were worried about what the private sector was doing, and we really wanted to create a bigger pool of domestic savings, So stepping away from the budget and the government, what we could do is we could increase the level of domestic savings by doing something like increasing the level of compulsory superannuation. Now remember, superannuation, that is that compulsory retirement savings that is put together for people. The payments go from their employer to the super fund, can't be touched until you retire. Now, if the government increases the level of compulsory super, so say it was 9.25% and they increase it to 10.25%, well then more money is going to be taken out of the economy, and then super funds, superannuation funds, who are collecting that money could then invest it somewhere else, could then support that domestic investment. So in terms of improving external stability, the government could stop running budget deficits and reduce its need for capital inflows and foreign debt. The other thing is the government could increase the level of compulsory superannuation, which would then give more funds domestically to try and fund vital investment. Okay, policy number 3. This third policy is that the government could try microeconomic reforms, so supply side measures really focused around aggregate supply. So the way this would work is that the government would try and improve the competitiveness, would try and remove regulations, restrictions, blocks on markets in some of Australia's export industries, right? If Australia's export industries are more competitive, wait to the plane, if Australia's exports are more competitive, then Australia could sell more, then Australia could get more revenue, and that could provide more money domestically, then we wouldn't need to bring in capital inflows. So the microeconomic reform is focused on making industries more competitive, particularly export industries, so they could sell more exports, increase domestic revenue, and reduce the need to bring in foreign capital. If we're thinking about particular microeconomic reforms, something might be improving infrastructure so that Australian firms can get more products overseas more quickly and sell them so that the whole process can be more efficient. And if you're thinking about how this would look, what we're trying to do is shift that aggregate supply curve to the right, to the right, to the right.
Perfect.
We're increasing aggregate supply, which will increase the amount of output or GDP and do it at a lower price. So this was a really quick look at the policies that can be used to address external stability. Just remember that external stability is not one of those key issues that government sets out to always try and address, that despite the size of the CAD and foreign debt, people don't seem too worried about it in general. Now, by the time you're watching this video, that could have changed and people are terrified about that. But it's not a policy area that the government sets out to solve. Just know that there are some options in case things get a little bit out of hand on the external stability front. Okay, thank you very much for watching. Any questions, put them in the comments. Hopefully the marking will be done soon, so I'll be able to set things up back the way they were and look at some of those other economic issues. Okay, until next time.